class and it was somewhat helpful. So I'm going to do it again since today's mostly a lecture day. I'm not going to record all of the classes, the ones that we do small group activities during, but I'm giving you tons and tons of information. Maybe helpful to have a recording. So I have started that, so that should be good. So here's what we're doing today. Mostly the lecture outline. We're doing two things. We're doing how to analyze an argument, which we've kind of already talked about before a little bit. And we're doing liberalism and IR, which we've also kind of talked about before a little bit. So not totally new things, just more information on both of these things that I've introduced a little bit so far. Yeah, just more detail for that. But any questions before we get started? So yeah, how to analyze an argument. We talked before about mostly about what the thesis statement is, right? Basically, the thesis statement is the answer to the question. In analyzing an argument, it's also to step back even before that and ask, what is the question? What is the question that the author is trying to answer? Which is sometimes stated explicitly, sometimes it's just kind of implied. But always you want to be thinking about what is the point of this article or argument or whatever it is that you're reading. What is it that they're trying to figure out? And then what's their answer, which is their thesis statement? What are the key concepts used? And possibly related to that, what assumptions are the authors using? That kind of goes into, I don't know, you can break this down in multiple ways. I think I did it differently over here. I said number 3 was like identifying the propositions. Who remembers what the propositions are? Did I say like the propositions of the argument in? Or just my examples? You remember what my examples were? We'll get to it. Okay.
Examples to back up the thesis.
Yeah, kind of. It's like statements or claims that create the argument that support the thesis. So basically, what you want to do when you're analyzing an argument is just identify all these different parts of the argument. What's the question? What's their answer? What are the propositions? What are the key concepts used? And there's 2 types I'll tell you about in a minute. What are the assumptions? That's maybe the hardest part, but I'll tell you like a hint, or what do you call it? A thing that helps you remember to help you figure out what the assumptions of the argument are. And then also like what types of evidence are used. I asked that, remember last time, I think on one of the in-class assignments. So by types of evidence, I have a slide on that, but I should have a slide. So let me just tell you right now. Types of evidence are, like last time it was historical case studies. Another type of evidence might be statistics. Another type of evidence might be like archival work, things that are like documents, official documents of governments or institutions and stuff like that. These are all different types of evidence that somebody might cite in order to back up their claim, their proposition of something that they're using in the process of making their argument. Does that make sense? So that's all I mean by different types. So if I ask that question, like an in-class essay, you know, something about like you don't have to identify specific evidence, but like what were the different types of evidence that something used is good to know. So yeah, that's it. That's a fairly good thing. I think I have different versions of this. And what we're going to do on Wednesday is another small group activity, this time with actual small groups of like just maybe 4 people, 3 to 5 people. And you're actually going to do this thing. We're going to analyze an article or an argument in your small groups. So you don't have to put it all together into an essay yet, but you're just going to be identifying the different parts. So I think we had this slide before. Remember, the propositions are these assertions, claims, and these were my simple examples. Not come from me. There's this famous thing. I don't know where it comes from. But these are propositions or statements or claims that go into building up an argument, a super, super simplified argument, right? Just that one proposition is all men are mortal. Second proposition is Socrates is a man. And then the conclusion, which is also a proposition, It's a proposition supported, or it's an argument supported by A plus B equals C. Basically, right? So these should both be logical and backed up by evidence. So if you have some evidence to cite that all men are mortal, you know, that would back up that proposition in that part of the argument. And in some other evidence to cite proving that Socrates is indeed a man, then that would back up that proposition. Both of these propositions being backed up and A plus B equals C equals a really solid argument. So that's what we're trying to identify, or at least, you know, look for these different parts of the arguments whenever we're reading anything, whether it's an academic article or a speech by a politician. But here's an example of what it looks like in an academic article. This is a paragraph from Robert Gilpin's theory of hegemonic war, so this should be totally familiar. We didn't read this article, but we talked about it a lot. But here's how this academic article describes it. He just comes right out and says that there's three propositions embedded in my theory. The first is this, and we listed those, right? That a hegemonic war is distinct from other kinds of wars. It's caused by broad changes in political, strategic, and other economic affairs. That's the first proposition. The second proposition is that the relations among individual states can be conceived of as a kind of system. And so that's the second proposition. So he needs that part. He needs both of these propositions to make his argument. Then he adds a third proposition that a hegemonic war threatens and changes that system. So their three propositions that go into making up their argument and their conclusion, which is, you know, hegemonic war is a thing that can explain some international events, such as the Peloponnesian War. So now I just put that up so you can kind of see what it looks like in an actual article. We did talk about it, but we didn't have an actual example. So hopefully that's helpful. Another one that I have is an example of what it looks like in an academic article. Here, of example of claims and evidence in an academic article. We're going to do this also at some point later on in the semester as well, like where you have an article and I'll ask you to do exactly this sort of thing, like identify the claims that are made in the article and then the evidence that are used to back up those claims. So this is an example of an article. I don't maybe have the title up here, but it's about Russian strategic culture and narratives. So if it says narratives, you kind of know, oh, that's constructivism. But you know, I've just gone through here and I've identified, here's a claim, and I've subdivided it into 1A and 1B. But this is a claim that they're making, and then this is evidence that they're using to support that claim. And then again, actually, here's another part. So it's still one claim, but I've just subdivided it up into 1C, and then more evidence, and then more evidence. In this case, it's a constructivist argument. So their evidence is often, constructivism is all about ideas, right? How ideas affect things, narratives. So their argument in a constructivist article, it's often historical evidence and archival evidence, but most often it's like the words of the speeches of leaders, for example, that will show like, well, this is how they were thinking at the time. So that makes sense, right? So you can use those, you can use the words and the official speeches. Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson is a primary document or piece of evidence that I'm using in my work, in my research. So proof that this is how somebody is thinking. Yeah. So does that make sense? For a constructivist type of argument. So this article, I used to find it, but it was kind of difficult because people kept thinking, well, it's about perceptions, not about reality. So that's why I had that note up there. It's not an objective state. It's a perception of a feeling of being vulnerable. So does that help a little bit to see what it looks like? You know, under having examples of claims and evidence within an academic article. So if I give you something, it would probably be a shorter article, but later in the semester, I'll give you something where I'll ask you to do this kind of thing. Does that make sense? You think you can do it? I think you can. Let me go back to this slide here. Key concepts and assumptions, like I said, these can kind of overlap and be the same thing, but there's two types. It's important to know. The first type are those assumptions that you use to build the argument, or key concepts that you use to build the argument. So that's something that already exists. The second type is a key concept that the author is introducing. That's part of their argument. That's part of their conclusion. So that's their unique contribution. So I don't know why I had this come up. It just came up in the previous semester, and it seemed useful to be able to distinguish concepts that the author is using, like they already exist, the author is using them, versus concepts that they're introducing. So Gilpin introduced that concept of the theory of hegemonic war, even though, yes, he says Thucydides talked about it, but Gilpin was the one who kind of put it all together and says, here's this thing. You know, like he presents it. It's so that's it, that becomes like his baby, right? Like that's his contribution to the academic literature. So, but he might be using other key concepts that already exist. So just being, and it doesn't matter, I won't ask you to distinguish between the two. So just identifying a key concept. So for the article, for example, was about the democratic peace theory. You would identify that, okay, the democratic peace theory, that's a key concept that's either being used or being invented if it's an article that kind of proposes that for the first time, that I would give you. But you would, either way, you would want to say that that concept of the democratic peace, that's a key concept for this particular argument. Does that make sense? So we had the hegemonic war as a key concept. The key concepts that we've talked about. Anything about realism. Realism itself is a key concept. I guess it could be pretty much anything. Oh, I guess I didn't finish that sentence. On Wednesday, we'll do a small group activity in which you do something. In which you like analyze, you identify the okay, so now we're done with one liberalism in IR. We're going to start with it's such a big topic. So I'm going to start here with the post-war world. Usually that term post-war still means post-World War II, even though there's been other wars since then. Whenever you see that phrase, usually it's always referring to after the Second World War. The Second World War was hegemonic war. It changed the entire system, right? So it's really important. So the post-world order, did we talk about defining that term world order? I think we did a little bit. Does anybody remember, like, what's a good definition or just a general concept? It's a key concept, the world order. What is a world?
One world, like government type thing, and then multiple.
That's a good way to put it, because actually we want to draw the distinction between, it's not a world government exactly in the sense of like, because there's that conspiracy theory where people think, well, it's this small group of people. So it's not that, but it is government in the looser sense in that it defines actions between states.
I was gonna say, any order that has like an international, so similar.
Yeah, global governance, yeah, just, you know, it's a set of rules and institutions, but also unspoken things like norms can go into creating a world order. I sometimes use the word regime, but world order is a little bit more common. But a world order is generally, so I said it's made up of institutions. So these are the institutions that make up the world order that was created after the Second World War. The ones that you read about in the modules for today. They were created by the victors of the Second World War. So in a sense, it is kind of something that the most powerful states create. Not kind of, it is something that the most powerful states create. The most powerful states, or the victors of the war, created these new institutions that were to govern the interactions between nation states for like decades to come, right? So that's, and what we call it is the liberal world order, or the Leo. Well, let me go back. Okay, we talked about this, I think, way back, and I think this was like the first or second week of class. when we talked about the number of states increasing after World War II. Like 1945, like less than 70 countries. But today there's almost 200. So that was a thing that happened as part of this wave of decolonization that happened after World War II. So why did that happen? Here's a good movie. The Battle of Algiers, one of those liberation movements. So why did that happen? We talked about the UN Charter. They called for respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of all peoples. And this week I introduced the Atlantic Charter, which was a similar thing. They were both, the one influenced the other. But just that the idea is that these are principles that formed the basis of the post-Second World War world order. AW's there. The post-world order, the post-war world order, otherwise known as the liberal international order, were based off of these ideas, right? So self-determination was a big one. And if you think about it, that was a really, really new thing. So put that into context and think about this. What would most of human history made up of, like empires and, kingdoms and, conquering various states and everything. Colonies from the ancients right up to the 20th century. We had the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and that phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? So all of that for hundreds and hundreds of years, that's the kind of thing that defined human relationships. So can you imagine after World War II, that goes away? Over the course of the 20th century, that starts to go away. These things become revolted. Revolted, that's another GRE word that's good, right? That just means taboo. Something is revolted, it's taboo, it's harsh, it's like not good, it's yeah.
Yeah, fun fact, the German word verboten is actually comes from the same root that the English word forbidden comes from, so.
Cool, yeah, so forbidden, taboo, yeah,
They
Julie.
mean the same thing, yeah, that's, verboten literally means forbidden.
Yeah, so these things become, passe. It's like not a thing anymore. What's that? Remember we talked about that concept of norms, how norms change over time? So you can see how momentous this change was. For hundreds and hundreds of years, we have empires, and now in the 20th century, that all starts changing. It's really hard for us in the 21st century to imagine how momentous that change was, because we kind of take it for granted now. Back then, and also I say this a lot with international law, like international law never really attempted by humanity before the 20th century. A little bit here and there, but nothing like what happened in the 20th century. And the 20th century was just this amazing thing where humanity, for the first time, develops a really significant framework for international law. And it's based on these principles like self-determination and decolonization. And all of these principles come from the Enlightenment. We had this slide up before, I think, too, right? Like, why did this happen? Because of changing norms and standards, also because of economics, but mostly because of changing norms and standards, expectations of behavior. So this is what was happening during the 20th century. We talked about customary law. I think on the very first week of class, I talked about customary law. It's like one of the three bases for international law. The other sources for international law are like treaties, they're like legal documents, and conventions like the Geneva Convention. So, so all of these institutions that were set up after the Second World War, these create the basis for international law, which barely existed before. So yeah, there's that other famous quote from Thucydides that I think we did talk about. That there's this scene in Thucydides where one of the, I think it's the Athenians, they're conquering this little island, and the little island is very small. They're basically told like, oh, you need to surrender. And they're like, no, we want to stand on principle. Our allies will come and save us. And Thucydides says, well, the weak suffer what they must. Well, the strong do what the strong dominate. The strong do what they will or what they want, while the weak suffer what they must. That's a realism thing, right? So the liberal world order rejects that idea. That's realism. The liberal world order says, well, there is still such a thing as anarchy, and international states, nation states are still the basis, but the anarchy is like a structured anarchy, you know? So, and here's this other thing that I wanted to tell you about. This is really important. Think about what was happening in the minds of the people who were building these international institutions. This is after, it's the late 40s. What happened during the 30s that was so influential? The Great Depression. So they had just gone through this whole decade of and it was worldwide. It wasn't just in the US, but worldwide, there was this, huge economic depression. And people generally thought that that was one of the causes of the war, one of the indirect causes. They thought, poverty leads people to extremism in fascism or in the USSR in the communist revolution. So, yeah.
Was Hitler poor growing up?
He was actually, he was a starving artist, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, he was a street person for a while.
Yeah, I knew he was an artist. I wasn't sure what his economic standing.
Yeah.
Screen.
So there was this idea that if we want to prevent this situation from ever happening again, then we need to have more economic prosperity. So FDR in the US had his New Deal, right? That seems to be very successful. So they wanted to take these ideas in the New Deal and transport them to apply them internationally. So because the idea is all about, preventing another world war from breaking out. And the idea is that economic interconnectedness creates mutual interest. Remember what we said what interests were, right? Or just the things that a government wants to do. So economic interconnectedness tends to make governments all want to do the same thing. They want to stay economically prosperous. So that's going to create incentives for those countries to want to avoid war. That's the thinking. That's how the argument goes, right? Does that make sense? So they were very, very concerned with how can we decrease poverty around the world? Not out of any, bleeding heart charity and kind of sentiment, not because of that. Because, that might be some part of it. That's great, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is because those things create instability and war. So they wanted to avoid those things. And so they saw economic development and institutions that could help economic development as being very important part of creating a stable international system, stable world order. And so because the international institutions that we have after the Second World War were based on these principles, it's called the liberal world order. It's not called the liberal world order because it's run by a bunch of Democrats. Okay. Does that make sense? Just in case there's some conspiracy theory out there that might say such a thing. But no, when you hear that word liberal world order, it doesn't mean that the world is run by Democrats. It means the principles that created the institutions that structure the world were created based on these ideas of, and these are some of those. So y'all read about the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank. So yeah, those are great examples, and they're all about creating more stable system. So we also had the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was like a precursor for the UN. It was when Churchill and Roosevelt met on a ship somewhere in the Atlantic, and they worked out the beginnings of what would become influential for the UN Charter. It was basically a proclamation. It set out their vision for a post-war world. So after the war, what? During the war, all of the major countries had issued statements or proclamations about what their goals were in the war. So that was a thing that had happened. Everybody said, well, here's what we want to accomplish. And specifically, Hitler's government said, well, we want to accomplish expansion. We want living room, right? Living room. Because they needed space to expand. So they said, our war goals are to expand. So the other countries said, well, our goals are to not do that, but to, have democracy and democratic rule of law kinds of things. Like they made their war goals precisely the opposite of Hitler's. And so they had these goals that were for the war. They were like, after the war, what does the world look like? And it's a similar kind of thing. Like our vision for what the world will look like when this horrible war is done is based on these principles. So they had, I guess, 8 common principles in the Atlantic Charter, which really emphasized the right to self-determination. Something that came back to bite England, especially when they had their colonies, right? Other people were like, well, England, you have all your colonies, but you have this Atlantic Charter, which you talk about the right to self-determination. Is there a little problem here? And Churchill tries to backtrack. Well, Roosevelt actually stands firm and says, no, they're right. You do have a problem with that. So there's a couple of articles. I think I linked to one of them in the modules. They're academic articles though, but you can read more about like that connection between decolonization and the ideas of the Atlantic Charter and the UN. So it's just another, this whole example, it's all about how ideas influence political events, right? So this is a great example of that. These were big ideas that definitely influenced the political order. So I think I have my definition of a world order, set of institutions, is rules, and so they could be very explicitly laid out rules and regulations, like the WTO has specific rules and regulations, right? But they could just be norms and ideas, things that are acceptable. The Lebensraum idea did not become a norm, one of those taboo things. So we sometimes you hear it abbreviated as the international order, the LEO. I say liberal world order, but the LEO is a thing that sometimes people say, liberal international order. Liberal internationalism or liberal institutionalism, same thing. It's just liberalism is all about international organizations, institutions. Those phrases all refer to the same thing. So if you hear liberal internationalism, liberal institutionalism, basically think that. Any questions? So far, is this sort of making sense? Here's another way that one scholar described it. This was from an article that I had assigned in a previous semester. But they describe it as a liberal world order equals, it's like a mutual aid and protection society. So, and it's defined by these things, that the idea that it's sort of like NATO or, a mutual assistance organization. We'll help each other out. But it's defined on openness and free trade, means economic growth. It's rules-based, the idea that there are rules, that in order to get what you want, you should follow the rules and not just invade another country, right? So yeah, Russia is violating this as we speak. So these rules facilitate cooperation and multilateralism. Like I mentioned, security cooperation, that's NATO. NATO's a military alliance. So specifically security alliance, specifically created because of Russia's past with invading and expanding to other countries. So, and then he also had this idea that international society is corrigible, which just means it's malleable, which is another basic liberal idea, this idea that states can learn. It's like people learn, when states interact with other states, there's this system and they learn from their interactions. So there's always like a previous thing, that game, like Prisoner's Dilemma game? You heard of Prisoner's Dilemma? Yeah, who can describe that? Anthony, I knew it was gonna be you.
Okay, so basically, like, let's say you and a partner in crime went over to someone's house, like murder them or something like that. And then the police go ahead and interrogate both of you and do different rooms. And they both say, we have evidence that you did this and your buddy is going to testify against you. And you don't know if they're lying to you or not. So that's a dilemma.
Right. So the question is, do you rat on your buddy or do you both? The best result would be like if you both stay silent. But But individually, there's an incentive for each person to rat the other one out and get the better deal, right? The classic, crime procedural, like I like to watch on TV. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. But this idea of learning is that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Do you know there was some previous interaction where you saw, oh, my buddy did rat me out last time, so now this time I'm going to be more likely to do that, or that they didn't, and so I'm going to be more likely to stay silent, and so we both get. So you see how that previous behavior affects your current decision? That's what they mean by the idea that states learn from previous interactions. Hopefully. You see how this is a little bit idealistic, right? Yeah, so it's definitely a much more optimistic view than realism. It's very, very cynical. Of course, we've seen how cynical it is. So yeah, like I said, states. So liberals still believe that the most important actors, the most important collective actors, are states. They say, but there's also organizations. So that's something that's different from realism. They agree with realists that the international system is anarchic, but they say, but we have all of these institutions that help structure that anarchy. So yeah, it's anarchy, but it's a structured anarchy. It's not complete chaos, for example, and it's not like a law of the jungle thing, like dog eat dog kind of world. So there's lots of overlap, but there's also some contradictions, between liberalism and realism, right? And the most important thing to remember about liberalism is that its roots go back to the Enlightenment. So we have some key themes of liberalism. I think these were mentioned in the video. Individualism or individual rights as over collective rights. That's where there's some disagreement, like Russia during the Soviet Union, for example, say, well, collective rights are important too. Liberalism really emphasizes individual rights. And that's for a very particular reason, like I told y'all before, Hobbes and kings. Liberalism is growing out of this movement against kings and monarchs. And so they're all about protecting the right of the individual against the absolute monarch. Individualism, freedom, reason, over superstition, religion, equal justice for all, toleration, various old white guys who identified as liberals. Yes, and notice that these principles and thinkers were ones who inspired the founders of the United States as well. So you're like, the United States is a country that's built upon a particular theoretical tradition, which is this. It seems familiar. So that's why a lot of us are like, oh yeah, well, of course we know what liberalism is, right? So that's why it seems so familiar to us. Jefferson was heavily influenced by Locke when he was writing the Constitution. So also, oh yes, we put in here this word democracy versus republic. So the word democracy used to be kind of pejorative, and so that's why they didn't use it. Like it meant sort of mob rule, chaos. So it was kind of a bad thing, right up until like somewhere, I forget exactly when, but 18th century, definitely by the 19th century. Those previous people that were on the previous slide, they would have all used the word republic instead of a democracy. Because democracy just used to have like a bad connotation to it. But they are basically the same thing. Whenever you see the word republic in a text, you can just replace that with democracy. Modern democracy. Sometimes smart Alex will try to show off and say like, oh, well, technically the United States is a republic. Well, that's true. Like they're saying, that the only democracy according to them is like a direct democracy, like in Athens. But that's kind of silly. So those people tend to have fragile egos, so it's best not to correct them, just smile and nod, which is generally good life advice for lots of times living in these polarized times. Just smile and nod, go about your way. So, but yeah, democracy equals republic. You can think of those as basically interchangeable. And just know that the old school writers, like those guys would always use that word republic instead of democracy for that reason. So Locke, I think I talked about Locke a little bit before. Locke's known for limited government and tolerance, or as he likes to use the word toleration. People have the right to life, liberty, and property, state, he says. That's also a contribution. And the government is obliged to protect these things. If government doesn't protect those things, then the people have the right to rebel and overthrow that government. That was his big contribution. Before him was Hobbes, who said, no, you have the sovereign has absolute rule. They have absolute power. And you give them absolute power because the law of the jungle is so much worse that it's my rational best decision to give all power to the sovereign in order to avoid being in a situation where my neighbor can cut off my head. So that was what Locke was responding to. It's like Hobbes first, then Locke comes along and says, okay, I'll take part of that argument, but I'm going to refine a little bit more. And that's how he refines it. Is he said, well, no, I'm going to say that there are some limits on what the government can do. And he's most famous for having that thing that people have a right to rebel against a government that doesn't do those things. So that's why he was so influential for the founding fathers, right? You can see the justification. Here's the Hobbes there. It's also about protecting minority rights and the prevention of tyrannies of the majority. You know, from the Federalist Papers, right? That becomes a big thing. So I think I've showed these slides before, so I'm gonna just skip through them. So here's Kant, he's the democratic peace guy. And here's 5 influential ideas from the Enlightenment. These are similar, you know, opposition to monarchy, separation of powers, you know, that balance of power. So you don't want to have too much power concentrated into one thing. So we separate powers and you have that checks and balances system that came into the United States. Liberty and individual rights, equality, free market capitalism. Did anybody see the video, the optional video of the conservative guy who's explaining liberalism? Anthony?
Yeah, I did.
Just one person? Well, check that out, you know, so because this thing is so confused because we don't talk about it anymore. But that liberals are conservatives in the US are liberals too, or at least they were before the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which has now rejected liberalism. But before that, if you want to hear a conservative explaining liberalism, check out that video. The difference is just like a matter of emphasis, really. Like they emphasize different aspects of that. I'm going to skip this slide as well, but it'll be in the module. Then there's this also thing. Did y'all pick up on this? The difference between negative freedom and positive freedom that was mentioned in one of the videos. So negative freedom is this idea that you're free from things that want to restrict you. You're free from, it's freedom from. Positive freedom is freedom to. And it's all about things that you need in order to enjoy that negative freedom. So, yeah.
Here's my question. What separates positive freedom from licentiousness?
I don't know. You can think about that. You can write about it in your essay if you want. So positive freedom is all about, like, if you're utterly poor, if you're living in poverty, it doesn't matter to you so much if the government has no right to tax you unfairly or do things, so if you have a lot of negative freedom, but you're living in poverty, they say essentially that doesn't matter. They don't have much freedom. So they say positive freedom is about giving you the things that you need to achieve whatever it is you want to do. That's real freedom. So that's what the positive freedom is about. Does that make sense? Question or comment? Oh. Okay. So you can, those videos will go through that. And this, I think I also had up here too. The 2 contradictory elements of, don't worry about it if you didn't get this in your question, just it's fine. But just to go over them again, to explain how there's 2 different kinds of liberals. There's the left progressive liberals, and then there's the conservative or right liberal. Both would still be liberals, except for, again, remember, we have to exclude Trump and the MAGA wing now because they're not liberals. But otherwise, George W. Bush, for example, and the neoconservatives still worked within the liberal tradition. But they had this thing about, democracy, the democratic peace that would ensure stability. So it tended to result in this policy of, democracy enforced at the point of the gun. So lots of people didn't like that, didn't think that that was a good way to go about it. And the difference basically boils down to, here's where the one place where you can imply, you can put the labels Democrat and Republican over here. Lots of other times in this class, I say, those don't necessarily coincide with the things I'm talking about. This is the one place where it does. There's a difference between Democrats and Republicans in the US. They're both liberals, but they have different emphasis. They emphasize different aspects of it. And it comes down to a lot of it comes down to that difference between negative freedom and positive. Okay, so we're doing good on time. You guys have a little bit more. Yeah, this is really important too. Sometimes students will think, well, liberals, they're not concerned about security. Realists are the ones that are all about security. This is not true. Liberals definitely are also concerned about security. They just think that the way you get it is through cooperation and institutions and things like that, not through war. So it'd be incorrect if you write something like, oh, liberals don't care about security. No. It's just all about how you get there. They disagree with realists about. So yeah, liberals think that the best way to security is for a state to be democratic, to have strong international organizations, and always have lots of economic interconnectedness. Because that's what creates those mutual interests and those shared interests between states. And states have what do you call it, incentive. They have an actual incentive to cooperate. That counts for a lot. So they're not necessarily pacifist or non-interventionist. That was another thing. Remember George Bush and the invasion of Iraq, stuff like that. Those were definitely not pacifistic actions, and it was done in the name of liberalism. Like we read in that Jack Steiner article. And they're not necessarily idealists. They could be, but they're not necessarily. Remember idealists were like Woodrow Wilson in 14 points. Yeah, that's like idealism. They would fall under liberalism, but obviously there's a lot of difference between Woodrow Wilson and George Bush, for example. It would be on different ends of that spectrum of liberalism. So yeah, same things, I think. Any questions so far? I know it's like a lot of material. Okay, yeah, so I have just enough time to go through this last point that I want to make about why people say liberal internationalism is on the decline. We've mentioned this a little bit before, right? There's this general idea, and I guess there's one thing about liberal internationalism, same thing as liberal world order, same things as liberal international order, same thing as the Leo. But this is on the decline now. So that's the last point that I want to end on for today is like, why is this happening? Why is this a thing? Has anybody heard of that organization, Freedom House? Heard of Freedom House? So they've been putting out, Freedom House is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group in the US that measures democracy. So in political science, we have at least 3 different basic measures of democracies, ways we can measure democracy. We have the Polity Index, Freedom House, and we have this other thing called the Varieties of Democracy Project. All of those are 3 different groups or ways that we have of measuring the levels of democracy in a particular country. So, so Freedom House is one of them. They've been issuing annual reports on like the state of freedom in the world, and they focus mostly on civil freedoms and civil and political rights. And they've been documenting a decline in overall in civil and political rights for like the past 15 years now. So generally, there's this idea of this general trend. Now this chart is a little bit misleading because of what did I say earlier? So this is, let me tell you what this is first. So this yellow line up here, that's autocracies. And this orange or red line down here, that's democracies. And this is the year 1900. So this is basically all of the 20th century. Here's 2000 right here, 20 years ago, and here's up to 2017. So what did we say? What would make this more complicated? Earlier in the class, I talked about this. What happened in how many countries were there on this end? Yeah, and how many countries are there now?
Over 200.
Yeah, so that's happening at the same time. So this chart is is a little bit misleading for that, but it's not misleading in the sense that it does show you the overall trend. The overall trend, despite the numbers of countries increasing, was that democracy was increasing throughout the 20th century. And also don't forget that if you go way back to the 1900s, and democracy was a very, very rare thing. Very, very few countries in the world were democracies at December. So that part of the map is true, like that very few democracies early in the 20th century, lots and lots of monarchies and empires and things like that. Most of those 70 countries that existed back then were that type. Democracy was in the US. And then there's some complicatedness with the UK because the UK is democracy, but it was also an empire. But basically what we see during the 20th century is this trend where democracy starts increasing. We get more and more democracies. And this is basically a visualization of that decolonization trend that happened after the Second World War. Well, countries were becoming free of their colonizing countries, right? India, all of these countries get created or declare their independence. Empires is no longer a thing. So this yellow line starts going down. And so this interesting thing happens here about just 20 years ago, where they're roughly similar, right? And then this is what we have going on. I should have gotten this other chart. I don't think I did, but I have another chart that's just this part right here. But what we're seeing now is this trend maybe possibly starting to reverse a little bit, and that's why everyone's really concerned. These people in the West are like generally really concerned about this trend of increasing autocracies and decreasing democracy, especially in the case of like there's a lot of populist authoritarianism, I think that's happening in various countries around the world. So why is that happening? That is the question. Under that liberal international framework, we talked about like the norm of like not invading other countries. So we have to ask ourselves, like, you know, this is old, but this is so roughly kind of true. But yeah, like, are these norms shifting again? So this is Russia invading Ukraine. Sorry. Israel. What about Gaza? Like, Israel did not appeal to the United Nations when the hostages were taken. They just invaded. So yeah.
About the Israel thing, I think there were like,
So the question though is, the point is that this is why people are wondering whether these norms that we just talked about are declining because of actions like these that states have taken recently. Okay. So here's the last point. So yeah, I guess we do have a little bit of time. We could have that debate, but we only have like 5 minutes. But the main thing I want to take away from here is that I want y'all to take away is that how many of you have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative? Jaden, Arjun, Anthony, Ian, was it Brent?
Rivet.
Somebody, another, like, so half a dozen people. So who can like explain what's Belt and Road? You hear that phrase? What do you think of? What is it roughly?
I think of infrastructure.
Infrastructure, yeah, Eden.
Yeah, it's essentially China going out to like developing countries, giving them money, and then expecting development return.
Yeah, right. Does that remind you of anything? Yeah, well, yeah, so good, but like more recently. That's why they call it the road, the Belt and Road, I guess, because of reference to that. But like more, what was I just describing earlier on? What did the US and its allies do after World War II? They developed a bunch of new international institutions that structured a new world order, right? That's what the Belt and Road is doing. That's what the idea is. It's building new institutions. There's also the Asian, some alternative to the World Bank that China is developing, right? So you can see China doing exactly the same things that the US and its allies did after World War II. That's how you create a world order. So the question is, if the Leo is declining, what would replace it? That's the question. Remember that world orders are created by the most powerful countries. So who's the most powerful country after the US? China, right? Maybe Russia's a distant third now. They were maybe closer third before they invaded Ukraine, but now they're more distant third. But you know, those are the most powerful countries. So if it sounds maybe good at, on the surface level that, well, you know, there's lots of legitimate criticisms of liberalism, right? And this liberal world order, it's basically US hegemony. That sounds really unfair, right? I think, well, maybe the end of the Leo is not so bad. But here's the catch. What replaces it is far, far worse. What replaces it is not some idyllic kumbaya moment where all of the countries get together and we're all going to create a fair and just equitable system. If that was the alternative to the Leo, I'd be all for it, replacing it. But the problem is that's not what would happen if the Leo declines. What would happen is that we get a world order created by China and Russia, China and or Russia, depending. And neither of those seem like very good alternatives.